Hey guys, welcome to Bottom Shelf Gaming, and what a year. I've always wanted to do a list like this, but what I found in the past is that I would feel guilty for not playing a lot of the games that people were talking about and that were nominated for many of the categories. This year specifically, I made a concerted effort and I played 13 games that came out in 2024 so that I could give you guys a full worst to best of everything that I played and give you a nice full spectrum here. So let's just jump right into it, starting at the bottom and working our way up to the top with number 13. Another Crab's Treasure. Starting off with a controversial one right away, but there was something about this game that just didn't work for me. Arriving on the scene is something of an instant indie darling. Another Crab's Treasure was released in April of 2024 and instantly met the comparison of a cutesy Dark Souls, to which I responded with, hell yeah. Actually playing the game though, I was reminded why so many Dark Souls clones don't quite work, and I found the gameplay to be a little floaty. For a quote-unquote cutesy game, it really challenges the player, but not in a way that feels especially good due to the imprecise nature of the combat and the high damage from moves with very little wind-up. I found a lot of humor in the little moments with the game and thought the color palette and world design were fun enough to explore, but overall, I was left a little salty at the game. It's one of those where I think a lot of the problems could have been cleaned up with some more extensive playtesting to tighten things up and really hone in on what makes these games fun. But poor performance on my PS5, bad camera that constantly got caught on things and hindered my ability to dodge, and a frustrating dodge mechanic in general put this at the bottom of my list. Yeah, it was a lot more disappointing than I expected. I'm gonna paint you guys a picture. It might be a little hard to visualize, but here we go. David Harbour. He's playing a detective in America's yesteryear, investigating a disappearance which results in him discovering and traveling to another dimension where everything seems just a little bit upside down. And then he has to fight Lovecraftian beasts that arise from the mist and are out for his blood. Can you picture that? Sounds pretty incredible, doesn't it? What's that? Stranger Things, you say? Never heard of it. No, I'm talking about Alone in the Dark, a video game from this year. Now, Alone in the Dark isn't a bad game. In fact, one game in, we're already breaking into games that I actually enjoyed this year. It's just that in a banger year for video games, it's one of the least good. The main gameplay stream is exploring a Resident Evil style villa that has several locked paths that require puzzles to be solved or items in order to access them, like a bolt cutter in order to cut some bolts and get into an area you couldn't get to before. This is basically never not entertaining in games, but I would say that this game doesn't succeed in the same way that the champions of the genre, like Resident Evil, do, and that's basically due to the combat. You're frequently interrupted from your clue-collecting, puzzle-solving adventure by some of the most impactless and clunkiest melee combat and shooting that I have experienced in recent memory. Where this game succeeds, though, is in its environmental design and storytelling. The game takes a few pages out of Alan Wake 2's book and crafts a world that is both terrifying and fun to explore. There are some really well-done transitions where you find yourself suddenly transported to the Upside Down. The Shadow Realm? I'm just going to call it the Upside Down. These catch you off guard and really do a lot to draw you into this world gone wild that Hopper is experiencing. The performances of various Bayou Noir characters are also pretty well portrayed, and the story as a whole is firmly in the good but not great range. It's a middle-of-the-pack game that seems to kind of know what it is, and it delivers exactly that. Give this a shot around Halloween, you could certainly do a lot worse. Okay, next up at 11. I am gonna get some hate for this one. This was one of my most anticipated games of the year, so it's even more frustrating to me than it probably is to you that it ranks so low on my list compared to games that weren't even on my radar. Imagine my surprise when I boot up this game that looked like the best thing since sliced bread and found a painfully simple combat system that prioritizes mashing the square button with no real combos or depth to find, a world that disincentivizes exploration with constant invisible walls and perplexing pacing overall. My favorite move in the game involved a parry mechanic where you encase yourself in rock and catch the enemy off guard if they try to attack, but there's almost no incentive for using it because you get no time to punish afterwards and it does some of the worst damage points-wise in the game overall. This made a move that felt very satisfying to use a little pointless, as it also used up a lot of magic, which is very useful in the combat system. But at least the bosses are good, right? Well, the least I can say is that there sure are a lot of them. With 107 bosses, there's at least a few hitters for sure, but I would have preferred less bosses with higher overall quality. I would say there are maybe 15 bosses in the bunch that are tuned to feel like a good mix of challenge while not being slam your face into the wall difficult. You'll go from one-shotting a boss without taking damage to losing 10 times in a row at the drop of a hat, and you're left wondering if you missed something. And you might have, because the game doesn't explain a damn thing. Taking one of my least favorite influences from the Soul series, but making it even more nonsensical, there are items that you can use in certain boss fights that, at least to my knowledge, have no indication of where you're going to find them or where you should be looking for them. And speaking of nonsensical, if anyone can tell me what is going on in this story, I would love to hear it, because it feels like you teleport from chapter to chapter without even a through line of plot carrying through. I feel like this game needs a full review to really dissect why I feel the way I do about it, but I'm done talking about it for now. Yeah, it has some good bits, but if there was an award for my most disappointing game, this would be it.
Peas. Not quite peas, not quite beans, but something special in between.
My 10th game of the year is Thank Goodness You're Here. And I would say that for what this game is trying to do, it's perfect. You play through a couple of set locations by interacting with characters and doing chores and tasks for them. You have one way of interacting with things, with the environment, with characters, and that's by slapping them, which incentivizes you to slap everything and everyone in sight just to see how they'll react, and a lot of them have little scripted bits programmed in that are actually really funny, so do go around slapping everything in the game. But the gameplay isn't the real focus here, it's the comedy. This is a game that builds jokes as you play, setting things up at the beginning of its 3-ish hour runtime that will pay off later in dividends. And they do, because the charming small-town British delivery is handled so well. With comedians like Matt Berry in the mix, it's no wonder that so many of the jokes land as well as they do, and if you don't let out a laugh by the end, you might just have no sense of humor at all. Definitely check this one out if you like your games on the funny side and don't mind a mostly passive, relaxing experience. This brings us to number 9, and this is where we kind of break into the games that I really enjoy. Number 9 for me is Rise of the Ronin, aka Friendship Simulator. Weirdly enough, this is going to have a significantly more positive tone than Black Myth, because I wasn't expecting a damn thing from this game. I have a history of finding Team Ninja's games pretty meh, unfortunately. Though I did eventually convince myself to like Neo enough to complete it, I just wasn't the biggest fan of the sequel, and I don't care much for their other attempts at games either, so to my surprise, Rise of the Ronin kinda knocked my socks off, honestly. At least at first. I initially felt that the combat, the parry specifically, was a little weird with the typical flow of melee combat in their games, but eventually I was stringing together combos and parrying enemies multiple times in a row. It builds off a combat system like Sekiro or Lies of P, and while I feel like it doesn't reach the same heights, it does have its own kind of charm that had me searching out fights to engage with it a little more. When you're working in weapon and stance switches into your combos, it just feels excellent to pull off some of these moves, and I was much more interested in the moment-to-moment gameplay that even than in Black Myth's combat, because it put in the work to keep me interested. But did the game keep me interested? I found the story engaging in the first and second acts, but the game just kept introducing characters and sidelining the interesting people that I met in the first half. It feels like such a fumble because it posed two sides of a conflict, the shogunate and the anti-shogunate, that both had their positives and negatives to the ways they were going about trying to achieve their goals. It had good characters on both sides, and a conflict that I found interesting and could root for either side given a different day. But then in Act 3, the conflict kind of has very little implication, as you end up working with many of the characters from both sides in the end. By the third act, I was very checked out, and I found myself getting worn down by the 3 separate maps loaded with too many collectibles and side activities. I love to 100% games, and a game like this is a nightmare for people like me. There absolutely is a such thing as too much content, if not all of it is fun, and the amount of boring side activities and repeated enemy encounters really started to bog down an otherwise pretty damn good game by the end. But I'm now somewhat a fan of the team, and I'm excited to see what they put out next, because damn, if some of these little moments I had in this game weren't super fun. Alright, number 8 is Warhammer 2. I basically don't have many bad things to say about this game. It got me into the Warhammer lore, which is awesome, and I think this game captures the aesthetic and tone of the series incredibly well. It plays nearly identically to World War Z, as it's by the same company that designed that game. The shooting feels great, the enemies respond realistically as you blow off their limbs and faces. The parries are also some of the greatest I've seen in a game like this, with you catching enemies by their heads and slamming them into the ground. The levels culminate in these choke points where the baddies will stack on top of themselves to reach you, and these are all very tense and fun to kind of set up as you're able to freely roam around the area and set up traps and kind of prep for what's to come. So why is this lower than it sounds like it should be? Well, that lies in the fact that Space Marine 2 is not really doing anything especially revolutionary, and it's incredibly short, with the campaign for this full-price game clocking in at just about 7 or 8 hours or so. For me, even a little less. There is a co-op mode and a multiplayer mode that are going to add a little extra time, but they aren't going to do that much to add time to your play if you don't already really love the game. there isn't much incentive to replay unless you just love how this game plays and works, which I do, so there you go. But I think this game kind of ends up middle of the pack because there's just so many other great games out there this year. Number 7. Animal Well. Okay, we're kind of getting into the realm of heavy hitters here. Animal Well kind of came out of nowhere. Just looking at it is the definition of an indie game. Made by Donkey Studio, this game is a Metroidvania puzzle game with no combat of which to speak, but that doesn't mean there aren't boss fights. Every portion of this game is a puzzle to figure out, including the bosses. It's a game that doles out tools and utilizes enemies in interesting and often revolutionary ways that I've never seen before. Using the animals and their specific traits to advance is something that just hasn't been done that often, and I'd love to see games take notice of just how cool of a concept this is. Now, the reasons as to why it isn't higher. Frustrating one-hit deaths, mixed with a save system that is location-based instead of screen-based, which can set you back multiple minutes of progress for a death that isn't even really your fault. The art style / color choice is sometimes beautiful, but it's also somewhat off-putting, and I don't really have an explanation as to why. I think it's just the color choices. It's probably just down to personal preference on my behalf, but for me, it took away a couple points there. And if I'm honest, it never got its hooks all the way in to where I felt like I had to keep coming back and playing, which is something that every game above this did do for sure. That brings us to number 6, Balatro. Perhaps the most surprising hit of 2024 was Balatro, and with good reason. It's designed by one guy, and I'm not sure if it was his intention, but it certainly feels like he captured the precise feeling of being my 80-year-old great aunt at a slot machine bender for 18 hours straight. Try to pull me away from Balatro, and I'll write you out of my will. Mixing a nostalgic art style and Moorish music that fits so well with the LSD card game aesthetic, it's surprising that it was all done by the same guy and not someone whose full job was music production. This is another one like Stardew Valley where one man has displayed such an incredible talent and ability to outperform full teams of AAA developers, or even quadruple A, I'm looking at you, Star Wars Outlaws, that I think we're looking at like a generational game with Balatro. It's similar to Tetris or Snake, where future generations are going to pick this up to see what all the hype was about and end up getting sucked into the addictive roguelike gameplay. You score by playing poker hands of up to 5 cards, which doesn't sound too interesting until you factor in the Joker cards, which are run-defining special cards that do things like make face cards score extra points, or multiply your score based on how many times you've played a specific hand. It doesn't sound super exciting when you say it out loud, but being able to build a successful run around a high card-based deck is insanely fun and just goes to show the truly innumerous amount of options provided. Really cool game, and I think the mobile version might just be the discovery for the cure for boredom. Forever? Alright, number 5. Okay, wait. Hear me out. This game is good. I went into this one with so much trepidation and dread. If you know me, you know I'm not a fan of anime. I see the appeal for some, but for me, the stilted dialogue, tropey characters, and writing just kind of puts me off it. There are some that have won me over, but for the most part, not a big fan. Starting off, the boob and buttage present in this game was something of an immediate turnoff, and it made it hard for me to take this game seriously. I was looking for a game to put near the bottom of my list, but somewhere around the first boss after the first couple hours I was playing, I nailed this parry chain in this boss fight, and I let out an audible gasp and an oh no. My girlfriend was in the room with me and she was like, "What?" And I hesitantly and ashamedly said, "I think I like it." It has the same parry-based gameplay as Sekiro and Lives of P that just so happens to be one of my favorite types of gameplay, but unlike Rise of the Ronin, I think it completely nails it and mixes in some interesting and unique takes to the formula. The bosses are actually incredible, and there is a boss rush mode accessible immediately from the main menu to engage in the combat even further. The story actually got its hooks in me, and I found myself intrigued by the mysteries and excited by some of the twists. The game's clearly inspired by Nier Automata, which the creator even cites as one of their main inspirations, but I think it outdoes Nier in essentially every aspect. The music is pleasant enough, the graphics are sometimes incredibly good, and fuck, I can feel myself becoming a weeb as I just keep talking about this game. We gotta move on. Number 4. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. This game has gotten overlooked from every Game Awards platform, and I just don't understand why. Maybe it's because it was released at the start of the year and people just forgot it existed, but this game deserves better. Look, Ubisoft is a company that is bad at making games. Their current model is to reduce, reuse, and recycle every series they own. They populate their maps with pretty little icons that take up 90% of the landscape and amount to doing the same things on repeat over and over. I don't like Ubisoft, but Lost Crown does nothing of this. And it's so sad that it hasn't received the attention it deserves, because to me, this is the best Ubisoft game they've put out in years. To me, this is a step below Hollow Knight, probably on par with the likes of Metroid Dread as one of my top Metroidvanias of all time. It's in the top 5, for sure. But what makes it so good? The combat is an excellent mix of combos, dodges, and parries that feels incredible once you master it. The upgrades that allow you to access more of the world, like the grappling hook and the upgrade that lets you set a point to zap back to, are not just used in exploration, but are incorporated in the boss fights as ways to dodge specific moves or deal damage during windows of opportunity. If you've played Sekiro, it's like incorporating the Goomba Stomp and the Mikiri counter into the gameplay, where certain moves have to be dodged or countered using this specific tool. And it just feels great. The moves are well indicated, so the challenge is tough, but very, very fair, and I never got mad at having to retry a tough encounter because it meant I got to try and do it better, and engage with the awesome combat even more. The platforming is also fluid and fun, and there are full challenge rooms designed around your different abilities. I was reminded of the Path of Pain in Hollow Knight, and some of the demanding B-sides in Celeste in some of these optional areas, and I just had a blast whenever I'd find them. This game also has one of the best map systems in Metroidvania history, where you can attach a screenshot to a location to see what you needed in order to solve a puzzle, and then return to the area when you have that thing, eliminating some of the frustrating backtracking if you do your due diligence early. I essentially have no complaints, except for the main character leaves something to be desired. I don't love his design or personality, and the story is kind of on the weaker side, but do not let that deter you from genuinely one of the most surprisingly awesome games I've ever played gameplay-wise. Check it out. Number 3.
I got a letter.
Silent Hill Remake. I had never played the original Silent Hill 2, and when I looked at the trailers for this game, it didn't look like it was going to blow me away like the Resident Evil 4 remake did last year. I honestly almost skipped it entirely, but looking for something spooky to play in October, I picked it up, gave it a try, and it almost immediately pulled me in with its mature and mysterious story, excellent performances, and honestly pretty fun gameplay. Typically in a game like this, the gameplay is just a vehicle for the scares, and while that is somewhat the case, the dodge is responsive and satisfying to pull off, and finding openings and enemies' patterns is the right amount of difficult. The mannequin legs especially have a certain flow to their swings that make them a lot of fun to fight and get used to. The bosses switch things up in exciting ways and are even more creepy when you realize what they represent, but the real things that drew me in were the story, setting, and characters. You meet the same people a handful of times throughout your journey through Silent Hill 2 who are on parallel journeys to James. As they venture through various torments, you're offered glimpses into their personal nightmares while facing your own. I don't want to spoil too much for those that haven't played, but this is an all-timer for a reason, and I think the remake does a great job of bringing it to the modern era. Oh, and the music is some of the best of the year. I thought about this game for weeks after I finished it, and honestly wanted to jump back into a replay as soon as I was done. Check it out, please. This game is great.
If you smart, dumb, ugly, pretty, it's all the same once you're dead.
Number 2.
May we meet again.
Shadow of the Erdtree. This is an interesting one for multiple reasons. The first is that it's a DLC. Let's get this out of the way. I don't necessarily think it should be Game of the Year because it is a DLC, and Elden Ring did already win in the year it came out. But I also do think that if a piece of content is the size of a full game and was the best piece of content that came out that year, it kind of deserves it too, doesn't it? There are very few DLCs I'd put in this Game of the Year consideration tier, but looking back, Blood and Wine from The Witcher 3 was probably the best content I played that year, and Elder Scrolls 4 Shivering Isles is essentially as good as the base game itself. So yeah, maybe this is my Game of the Year. The second reason that this is interesting is that at first, I wasn't super enjoying this DLC. Sounds funny because I'm ranking it so high. It is my number 2 Game of the Year, but the first couple bosses felt hard for hard's sake and not super fun to fight. Part of this is my fault as I was on New Game Plus 3, but the attack patterns and constant barrages were making me think this was more of the portions that I didn't love so much in Elden Ring towards the end. By the end of the DLC, I had basically done a complete 180 as 3 of the bosses in the DLC I would consider in my top 5 best bosses in the entire game, base Elden Ring included, and possibly of all time. The last boss was an exercise in frustration at times, but was a rewarding challenge in the end when I eventually overcame it and came out on top, and I would say it was blown out of proportion a little bit. Guys, Malenia was harder. Come on. Number 1, Astrobot. Yeah, it turns out I agree with Jeff Keighley's Game Awards 100%. I bought this game on a Friday and had beaten it 100% by Sunday morning. My cheeks hurt from smiling and my thumbs hurt from joysticking, but no other game had me in constant awe at every aspect of it. I loved the celebration of gaming, the history of PlayStation. For those that complain that it's a commercial for Sony, so what? It's one of the greatest commercials I've ever seen and experienced, and I was enamored by everything the game did. Taking inspiration from Mario Galaxy, the power-ups and mechanics introduced throughout the levels changed the way you interact with the game mechanics, from shrinking you down to bite size so you can enter mouse holes, to strapping you with a rocket dog to blast through breakable objects. This game also has some of the best collectibles I've ever seen in a video game, in that you collect these robots dressed as video game characters that appear in the hub world and you can interact with. And those gameplay vignettes where you play as some of the franchise-based characters are some of the greatest homages and level designs that fully capture the spirit of the games they reference. Astrobot is a love letter in the truest sense that also has all the bells and whistles to pull it off and fully deserves its spot as the best of the year. Well, guys, that's going to wrap up my best and worst video. It's going to cover every single thing that I played this year. What do you agree with? What don't you agree with? I'm looking forward to a lot of games that are coming out in 2025. Please check out my Master of Games series, consisting of me and 3 of my friends challenging each other to play games in interesting ways, where one person is going to be named the true Master of Games at the end of the series. That's going to be linked in the description here. And also leave a comment on anything you agree with or disagree with, and put your list in there too. I'd love to know what you found to be the best game of the year, or what surprised you this year. Please keep checking back to Bottom Shelf Gaming, and we'll see you soon.